This is Michel Gérald Boutet, and welcome to Druid Talks. Today I'd like to speak a bit about the Druids and Celtic religion. For those who know a bit about the neo-pagan or neo-druidical community, know that that the Druids are earth-based, as in philosophy, that they are mainly peace-loving, that they would be, let's say, considered as radical leftists if we are to trust or believe what is being told about the neo-Druidic people. That the neo-Druids have no problem giving the ancient Druids any kind of radical leftist thought and philosophy that would, let's say, fit today's political activism. But this is completely false. Again, this is a hoax. That you'd have ancient Druids contesting or going up against the authority, the national authority, be it the royalty or elected politicians. This wouldn't have been the case in antiquity or in early at the early medieval stage, before the Christianizing process was completed. This is that there would have been such a thing as Druids against Trump or Druids against Brexit, things like that. It wouldn't have existed. Of course, there would have been, let's say, a organized protest against a monarch who was, let's say, not living up to his the expected generosities and policies of the people. So in that sense, there would have been, let's say, an uprising of the educated elites against such a tyrant. Tyranny wasn't accepted in these societies, Germanic or Celtic, since the king had the moral obligation to bring prosperity and welfare to his people. A good king was one who had diplomatic ties with others and was able to bring in prosperity. So in that sense, this would have never existed. One day, a neo-Druidic person came up to me and said, well, you know, the Druids were against elitism, which is absolutely to the contrary. The Druids were elitists. In fact, they were picked from the best families and instructed and educated. Their curriculum took about 20 years. So if we trust what Diviciacus told Julius Caesar in his war commentaries, hear this, war commentaries by Julius Caesar, there are many passages that describe what Diviciacus taught to his students, and this is it was shared to Julius Caesar. He says that Julius Caesar writes that the Druids are a priestly caste. So therefore, if they're a caste, they have to be elitist. They regulate public and private sacrifices and decide religious questions. The people hold them in great respect, for they are the judges of practically all intertribal as well as personal disputes. They decide all criminal cases, including murder and all disputes relating to boundaries and inheritance, awarding damages and passing a sentence. Any individual or tribe refusing to abide by their decision is banned from taking part in public sacrifices. And we know in the Indo-European societies and later on during the cultural separation of the different Indo-European peoples, that their basic religion was mainly oriented towards cult and sacrifice, therefore very ritualistic. The heaviest of all punishments was not to be able to take part in rituals, of course. The effect of this excommunication is to set the guilty party on a level with the vilest criminals. He is shunned by all. His conversation and his presence are avoided for fear of contracting ritual uncleanliness. He is barred from all honors and dignities, and he has no redress in the courts. So as we can see, this is terrible judgment. In today's world, anybody going up against the accepted authority, which wasn't tyranny, would have been treated in the same manner. The Druids hold office under the supreme jurisdiction of the Archdruid, who is succeeded on his death by the next senior. If there be several or equal rank, the succession is determined by the votes of their colleagues, or sometimes even by armed forces. A chapter is held on a fixed date each year at a sanctuary not far from Chartres, which was the center of Gaul, a bit like Tara was the center of Ireland for the Gaelic people, which is reckoned the center of Gaul, as I said, and litigants from all over the country meet there for final judgment upon their disputes. Now, the doctrine of the Druids. Okay, so if the Druids were, let's say, people who had high regard for nature, were globalists, would be very tolerant, would accept any kind of foreign philosophy and religion. If that was the case, then the Druids wouldn't have maintained a traditional teaching upkeep that was similar to that of the Vedic people in India, or the Hindus. And so in that sense, the Celts maintained a religion that was very traditional for the Indo-Europeans and very close to that of what you have in India with the Brahmins, the Kshatriya, and the Vaishyas. They're the three classes. The priests, the warriors, and the artisans, and peasants and farmers, and all of the producers. So basically, the society was stratified into three classes, and each one had a different type of devotion. We will see that just a bit later. The Druidical doctrine is commonly supposed to have reached Gaul from its original home in Britain, okay? And it is a fact that to this day, men going on the highest studies usually cross to Britain for the purpose. Well, we know that in Britain there were henge schools and around Stonehenge and places like that, Avebury. And so in antiquity, Britain was a center of learning, and this is where even the Gauls sent many of their people, students, to be educated to a higher echelon, higher degree. The Druids are exempt from military service and do not pay the same taxes as the rest of the people. Such privileges attract a crowd of students, some of whom offer themselves for instruction, while others are sent by their parents or relatives. So they pay their fees or tuition. The family usually wants to maintain their status in that class of people, of the scholarly and educated, and so they prepare their children for higher education. It is said that these young men have to memorize endless verses, and some of them spend as long as 20 years at their books. For although the Druids employ Greek characters, they had a form of, they had an alphabet that resembled Greek characters. It could have been, let's say, for someone like Caesar, confused with Greek characters, but evidently if they knew Greek writing, it means that they were highly educated. And as we know, in Iberia, the Iberian alphabets, the Celtiberians had different alphabet scripts that were very close to the Greek alphabet, but a little bit more complex. So they used these characters for most of their secular business, such as public and private accounts. So that means they left annals and written accounts. They consider it to be irreverent to commit their lore to writing, which means their lore is that they're teaching, their oral teaching, philosophy and eschatology and other forms of theology. I suspect, however, that a double motive underlies this practice: unwillingness to publicize their teaching, and a desire to prevent students from relying upon the written word at the expense of memory and training of memory. For recourse to textbooks almost invariably tend to discourage learning by heart and to dull the powers of memory. Their central dogma is the immortality and transmigration of the soul, a doctrine which they regard as the finest incentive to courage, since it inspires contempt of death. But they also hold frequent discussions on astronomy, physics, and theology, in all of which subjects their pupils receive instruction. So this pretty much explains, Julius Caesar here pretty much explains what the doctrine of the Druids and what their practices and their teachings were about. And you know, many neo-Druids or people in the pagan community would say, you know, oh, Caesar said that there was nothing that was written down, and we have no written archive or texts that were found of the Druids explaining or expounding their teachings and things like that. Well, this is sort of like a lazy way out, you know, in a way. This gives them a chance to invent things and fill in the gap and, you know, remove the vacuum and replace it with hot air. And that's about what happens usually. All of this is pretty much left to the imaginings of the person who is pretending to be a Druid or a neo-pagan or neo-pagan Druidess or Druid or Bard or whatever. And so it would be a good idea, let's say, if we would take the time to look into closely into the Druidic ancient doctrine and closer by looking at some of the texts that they did leave, some of the legal texts that were found in archaeological situations. In another video, I spoke about the Coligny calendar that was discovered in France, a Gaulish calendar with lots of information there on the astronems and the months and things like that. And they also left other examples that were discovered and that the epigraphists have worked out. Many texts come from Spain, from the Celtiberians, from the Tartessians, from the Lusitanians, some from northern Italy, many in Gaul, around the Alps, and some in Britain. And of course, there are all of the Ogham monuments, Oghamic monuments in and around the British Isles, Ireland and Scotland and parts of Wales. So this, you know, it gives you a fair idea of the vastness of it, and this way we can argue that there were written statements that were left behind. So if we are to look at the elements of Celtic religion, now there is a great difference between, as I mentioned earlier, the different classes. In India, you know, the sampradayas, I mean the lineages, the philosophy, go along certain devotions towards certain gods. And usually these are according to the different caste to which they belong. That is because in the early Indo-European religions, as Caesar mentioned, he by describing the Celts of Gaul, that there were three different classes. So the Druids, who were the most educated, of course, their devotion was to a neutral god who was more like the supreme godhead of the Vedic Indians. Of course, they were almost exclusively monists in their approach, a bit like the Shaivists in India. And in certain cases, there were many of the Druids or priests that were, let's say, chaplains for warriors of the second, as we have seen, you know, in the Arthurian cycles with Merlin and Arthur, who were chaplains to a warrior or warrior band. And there were also priests who were in charge of temples and who were, let's say, chaplains and abbeys for the common class or people of the third producers guild, such as artisans and peasants and farmers and things like that, people of that range. So we, as Dumézil in his comparativist approach found, the first function was mainly was close to the abstract, and so evidently personal devotion to a personal god would have been unthinkable. Then in the second class with the warriors, religion and devotion was dualistic, in that since there was a moral struggle with good and evil, the devotions of the warriors tended to be dualistic. And then with the popular class, it was a bit like in, let's say, Catholic religion, where the popular devotion went to saints and the Virgin Mary and things like that. They had also this kind of devotion for the many types of gods, and we have found many in epigraphy, especially in France and around. And so we can say that Druidic faith, practice, and philosophy was defined by the adherence to a set of ethical rulings comparable to Vedic Dharma, which was termed Dedma in Old Celtic, and in Gaelic, or Gaulish, it was Dema, deriving from an early Proto-Indo-European root. And this meant statute and customary law. So there was also a notion of balance and poetical sensibility, which was called Anao. And the sages of antiquity, especially in the Vedantists and the Druids, practiced grammar and using wordplay, and it's called shlesha in Sanskrit. And this wordplay was called Anawi di Widtu, and it was the word Anao meant good harmony, poetry, and balance. And so the Anaos was one who practiced the balance of being, of tempers and things like that. So evidently the ancients believed in tempers, and so this was a form of mastery. Let's say it would have been absolutely necessary to be able to practice Anao if you were either a warrior or a druid in all of the difficult occasions that would present themselves in everyday life. So Dedma, to really define it really precisely, the Gaelic or Gaulish term for Dedma was Dema, or that was Dharma in that language. In Old Irish it was Dedn, and in Cymric it was, or Old Welsh it was Def, and it was defined as a form of status or deposition, a statutory law, something which was understood and guarded by everybody. And so in today's world, you know, if one calls himself a neo-druid or a druidess or a pagan and whatnot, and if you don't practice or you don't have any notion of what is the dharma of your people, the Dane or the Dedma or the Dema, then there is no possibility to practice this religion as it is supposed to be practiced. Then there was Wekos, the sacred obligation, a contract, which it ties the practicing, the devotee to the community and to the gods. And so Wekos is a debt, is a trust. It's to swear fidelity. It's therefore something which binds by the word. So if we are to look in the word truth, let's say, evidently truth was a very important part of it. As we know, Vidya, which was the old Celtic word for it, is also in Sanskrit was called Vidya, and that's where you get the Druid name from. It's from Druidya, which meant or means true, firm, steadfast, and hard wisdom or knowledge. So the Druis was a firm knower, a savant, a scientist, and had nothing to do with, let's say, the term as it was understood during the medieval ages or in the Renaissance, Drui or Derwid, as some silly magician or sorcerer or witch. a warlock. And the druid was someone who practiced the firmest and the most astute knowledge, wisdom. So if we are to look what binds the believer is the man, the person, which is vir or wir in either the Romance or Celtic languages, means that the man is truth, because vira is truth and viros is the man. So there was an old Irish saying, Gaelic sayings, which says that when a person dies, truth dies with him. And so this pretty much sums it for that. So there, one firin, the enduring truth, that was the antithesis of neam firin, the hostile truth. The nature of dema also infers one firin, lasting truth, which is the antithesis of neam firin, the hostile truth. So if we are to compare the different old Celtic languages, you look at the Gaelic term fjord, you get the Gaulish wira, and it means true. Firin, wiriona in Gaulish, sincerity and truth. Fir in Gaelic, and viros in Gaelic, man. So the Romans also maintained this simple wordplay to express the moral obligations of the civilized man through wordplay also, by virtus, virtue, veritas, truth, and vir, man. As we see in Roman society, one of the obligations of the citizen of Rome was to respect the gods and maintain public sacrifice or public devotion. And this was something that was also practiced in Gaul and in other parts of Celtdom. So through this we discover that the ancient philosophy, the basic fundamentals of religion for the ancient Celts had nothing to do with what today we would propose or suppose or suggest concerning Celtic religion and concerning Druidism and things like that. So without Anawo, there's no Dema, and without Wiriona, truth, there's no Dema, and without all of this in perfect balance, there would have been no Dema. That is, no Dharma for the Celts. So this about sums up the basic understanding of what ancient Druidism was and what the ancient Druids professed. And so, but just to close, I'd like to also mention that the Druids, in their monist way of devotion, were pretty close to, let's say, what today we would consider as, let's say, with the Buddhists, let's say a philosophy or a theology with no gods, the gods were relegated to either the second class of warriors or to the third class of producers. And the Druids themselves did not, let's say, um, give a special cult to these gods or goddesses, but preferred to remain within the secrecy of their own guild or brotherhood. So the gods, as Caesar mentions in his war commentary, was the god Dispater, which is the Latin name that Caesar gave to this god, and this Dispater was the god of death and dissolution, a bit like Shiva in India, and so it's interesting that Caesar does not name the god, or he doesn't name the Celtic gods of the Gauls, mainly probably because Dewi Kiakos did not himself give the name to Caesar. But we know through other mentionings that the ancient Druids called their god, the god of the Druids, they called him Gutan Ucherimon. Gutan Ucherimon means the supreme being, or the one who is addressed on high. And the fact that it's at the neuter case means that this entity was not seen as either masculine or feminine, so it was completely out of the biological or human realm. So these are the basic specifics of it. Later on, I'll mention or do a video on the warriors class and their special devotion, and then the popular polytheist devotions of the people. And so if you enjoyed, give me a thumbs up and leave a comment below, and I'll leave you the links to articles, to my articles, also below.